My beloved one, stop for a moment and listen carefully, because there is something you have never seen, something hidden behind ordinary conversations, quiet glances, unfinished sentences, and moments that seemed completely meaningless to you. And if you could see what has been happening inside the heart of someone who keeps looking at you and then looking away, you would finally understand why some moments between you have felt strangely heavy, strangely quiet, and strangely impossible to explain. You think you are simply being yourself, but you do not realize what your presence does to someone who has been trying desperately to remain composed around you, because every time you appear, something inside that person becomes unsettled, and every time you smile without knowing what that smile means to them, another wall they built around their emotions begins to crack. Yet there is one reason they have never allowed you to see the full storm. You really are innocent in this. You have no idea how many battles have been fought silently because of you, not battles against you, but battles against feelings that arrived unexpectedly and became impossible to dismiss, because somewhere along the way, your presence stopped feeling ordinary, your voice stopped sounding like just another voice, and your absence began to leave behind a silence that felt far too loud. And perhaps the strangest part is that you never asked for any of this. You never demanded attention, you never forced anyone to feel something, you never walked into someone's life carrying a promise that you would change everything. You simply existed as yourself, and somehow that was enough to awaken something that had been sleeping inside another heart for longer than you could possibly imagine. But why would your simple presence have such power? There were moments when you probably noticed something unusual. A pause that lasted too long, a look that disappeared the second you noticed it, a message that seemed carefully written and then strangely distant, a conversation that suddenly became deeper before quickly becoming ordinary again. You may have wondered whether you were imagining things, whether you were reading too much into small details, whether that person's behavior meant anything at all, but what you did not know was that every small moment was creating another layer of tension inside them, because they were trying to stay steady. That is the part you never saw. They were trying to act normal when their thoughts were anything but normal. They were trying to speak casually while their heart was saying things their mouth was terrified to reveal. They were trying to convince themselves that they could stand near you without becoming emotionally exposed, but the closer they came to you, the harder that became. And eventually even they had to wonder why you affected them so deeply. There is a storm inside someone that you cannot see, not the kind of storm that makes noise, not the kind that announces itself with thunder. It is the silent kind, the kind that happens behind a calm expression, the kind that begins when someone remembers your face at night and suddenly realizes they have been thinking about you far longer than they intended. The kind that makes a person stare at their phone without sending the message they desperately want to send, the kind that makes them wonder whether they should move closer or protect themselves by walking away, and perhaps you have mistaken that distance for indifference. Perhaps you thought that because they did not say what you hoped they would say, they did not feel anything at all. Perhaps you interpreted their silence as an answer, but silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes silence is where the loudest battle is happening. You don't know how many times they have almost told you, almost, That word matters more than you realize. Almost sent the message, almost admitted the truth, almost asked the question, almost told you why they looked at you that way, almost confessed that something about you had become impossible to ignore. But every time they reached the edge of honesty, fear pulled them back, and you were left standing on the other side of a silence you never understood. They were afraid of changing everything, because once something is spoken, it cannot easily be taken back. Once a hidden feeling becomes a spoken truth, the relationship can never return completely to what it was before, and they were terrified that if you knew what was really happening inside them, you might look at them differently. They were afraid that the person they secretly hoped would come closer might instead step away. They were afraid of losing even the little connection they already had with you, and there was another fear beneath all of that, one they rarely admitted even to themselves. What if they cared more than you did? That question followed them. It followed them when they were alone. It followed them when they saw your name. It followed them after conversations ended. It followed them into the quiet hours when there were no distractions left and the truth became harder to escape, because during the day, they could pretend. At night, pretending became much harder, and you were simply living your life. You were laughing. You were working. You were dreaming. You were trying to become stronger. You were carrying your own invisible burdens. You were not standing somewhere calculating the effect you were having on another person's heart. That is why your innocence matters. You were not trying to become unforgettable. You simply became unforgettable. You were not trying to awaken something. You simply touched something that was already waiting to awaken. There is something almost mysterious about the way certain people enter our lives. They do not always arrive with dramatic music. Sometimes they arrive quietly. A conversation, a familiar face, a chance encounter, a moment that seems insignificant, a sentence that stays in your mind longer than it should, and then, slowly, something changes. You begin noticing them, they begin noticing you. The world continues moving normally, yet something inside your experience has shifted. You cannot explain it. You cannot prove it. You simply know that something feels different. And perhaps that is exactly what happened here, but there is a detail you have not considered. The person who is struggling with these feelings may not even understand them completely. They may have spent so much time controlling themselves that they never stopped to ask what their heart was actually trying to say. They may have called it admiration, then friendship, then curiosity, then attachment, then something they refused to name. But every name eventually became too small for what they were experiencing, because this was not simply about attraction, it was about recognition. Something about you reminded them of a version of themselves they had forgotten, a softer version, a more hopeful version, a version that still believed something beautiful could happen without being destroyed by fear. And that is why being around you became both comforting and frightening. You made them feel seen without trying to see them. You made them feel vulnerable without asking them to open up. You made them remember emotions they had carefully buried. And when someone has spent years learning how to protect their heart, meeting a person who makes them want to open it again can feel less like peace and more like danger. So if you have ever wondered why their energy seemed to change around you, Perhaps now you can understand. Maybe they became quieter because they were trying not to reveal too much. Maybe they looked away because holding your gaze felt too revealing. Maybe they suddenly changed the subject because the conversation was getting too close to something real. Maybe they disappeared for a while because they needed distance from emotions they could not control. And maybe, when they returned, they acted as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something enormous. Something invisible. Something that had been growing beneath the surface while you were unaware. There were nights when they probably asked themselves whether you had noticed. Did you notice the way they remembered tiny details? Did you notice how quickly they recognized your mood? Did you notice how their voice changed when speaking to you? Did you notice that they could remember things you had forgotten saying? Did you notice that they seemed completely normal until you entered the room? They wondered, and the more they wondered, the more nervous they became, because if you had noticed, then perhaps you already knew, and if you already knew, then perhaps you were waiting for them to say something. But what if you were waiting too? That is where the story becomes complicated, because sometimes two people can stand incredibly close to the truth while both believing they are standing completely alone. One person waits for a sign, the other waits for permission. One person fears rejection, the other fears being misunderstood. One person thinks the silence means there is nothing there, the other uses silence because there is too much there, and somewhere between those two fears, an entire story can remain hidden. Perhaps that is why certain moments between you have felt unfinished, because they were. A conversation ended before the real question was asked. A goodbye happened before the real feeling was expressed. A message ended with a simple sentence when both people were thinking about something much deeper. A look lasted only seconds, but somehow remained in memory for days.